In the spring of 1776, a French playwright walked into a meeting with the King of France and made an argument that would change the history of the world. His name was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais. He was the son of a watchmaker. He had taught himself music, invented an improvement for the pocket watch, talked his way into the court of Louis XVI, written a play called The Barber of Seville that had just become the most celebrated comedy in Paris, and somewhere along the way had also become one of the most effective spies in Europe. He was not a general. He was not a diplomat. He was not a minister of state. He was a playwright who moonlighted as an arms dealer, and he had come to Versailles to convince the most powerful monarch in Europe to secretly fund a revolution against Britain using a fake trading company through a chain of shell transactions in a way that could never be traced back to the French crown. His argument was simple. France had been humiliated by Britain in the 7 Years' War. They had lost Canada. They had lost India. They had been stripped of their empire piece by piece at the peace table in 1763, while British diplomats smiled across the room. And now, across the Atlantic, 13 British colonies were pointing muskets at their own king. Providence, as Vergennes, the French foreign minister, would later put it, had marked out this moment for the humiliation of England. The king agreed. He authorized 1 million livres, and Beaumarchais walked out of Versailles to build the most sophisticated covert arms operation of the 18th century. What happened next was not just a diplomatic agreement or a change of alliance. It was a secret war, a war France fought in the shadows for 2 full years before anyone could officially admit it. And without it, there is a serious argument to be made that the American Revolution does not survive 1777. To understand what France did and why, you have to go back to the wound. The 7 Years' War, what Americans call the French and Indian War, ended in 1763 with a peace treaty that broke France as a global power. Before the war, France had an empire that stretched from Quebec down through the Mississippi Valley to Louisiana, with trading posts across India and sugar islands in the Caribbean. Britain had colonies on the Atlantic seaboard and trading companies in Bengal. The two empires had been fighting each other in various forms for nearly a century. The 7 Years' War ended that competition definitively and not in France's favor. Canada was gone. The Mississippi Valley was gone. The Indian trading posts were gone. France kept some Caribbean islands and a handful of outposts, enough to remind them what they had lost, not enough to matter. Britain emerged from the war as the dominant colonial power in the world, and France emerged from it humiliated, bankrupt, and furious. The ink on the 1763 treaty was barely dry before French ministers began planning for the next round. The ink was barely dry on the Treaty of Paris in 1763 before the French Foreign Ministry began planning and preparing for the next war with Great Britain. They rebuilt their navy. They sent agents to America to watch the growing tension between the colonies and the crown. In the 1760s, Etienne François, Duc de Choiseul, chief minister to the King of France, sent agents to America to gauge the potential strength of the colonies and their dissatisfaction with Britain. Those agents came back with reports that the colonists were restless, increasingly defiant, and that a rupture with the mother country was not merely possible, but likely. When Charles Gravier, the Comte de Vergennes, became French foreign minister in 1774, he inherited both the plan and the rage. Vergennes was not a hothead. He was a career diplomat of 57, meticulous and patient, who had spent decades representing France at courts across Europe. He was not the kind of man who made dramatic speeches, but his private correspondence about Britain is something else entirely. While Vergennes was giving fair words to the English ambassador, he wrote in a different strain to the Spanish minister, telling of England's crimes and suggesting that an opportunity now offered to obtain revenge for them. That nation, he wrote, is as depraved in its politics as in its morals. England is the monster against which we should be always prepared. When shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, Vergennes did not see a colonial uprising. He saw an opportunity. The question was how to exploit it without triggering a war France was not yet ready to fight. The answer came from a playwright. Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais is one of those historical figures whose life is so improbable that if you wrote it as fiction, the publisher would send it back with notes asking you to make it more believable. Born a Parisian watchmaker's son, Beaumarchais rose in French society and became influential in the court of Louis XVI as an inventor and music teacher. At the age of 12, he had been apprenticed to his father. By his early 20s, he had invented an improvement for the escapement mechanism of the pocket watch, the part that makes the ticking regular, that was so elegant it caught the attention of the royal court. He parlayed that invention into a position teaching music to the daughters of Louis XVI. He parlayed that into social connections that opened every door in Versailles. He married a wealthy widow, acquired a patent of nobility, and gave himself the aristocratic surname de Beaumarchais from a small plot of land his first wife owned. The first wife died within the year. The second wife died shortly after. Rumors circulated. Nothing was proven. Along the way, he also became, as multiple biographies have described him, a spy, a smuggler, a publisher, an arms dealer, a diplomatic fixer, and the author of two of the most celebrated plays of the 18th century, The Barber of Seville, The Marriage of Figaro. Works so subversive in their mockery of aristocratic privilege that King Louis XVI himself reportedly said of The Marriage of Figaro that it would require destroying the Bastille before the play could safely be performed. And then the play ran anyway, to thunderous applause, 5 years before the Revolution actually destroyed the Bastille. Beaumarchais was not merely a colorful figure on the margins of history. He was plugged in, politically connected, and genuinely obsessed with the American cause from an early stage. While in London on an assignment for the French crown in 1775, he met Arthur Lee, younger brother of a powerful Virginia congressman, and the two of them began talking about what France could do for the colonists. Neither had authorization. Neither cared. Beaumarchais began writing letters back to Paris urging French intervention. He told Vergennes and the king directly, the quarrel between America and England would soon divide the world and change the system of Europe, and France had a choice about which side of that change it stood on. Vergennes forwarded the letters to Louis XVI, and when the time came to find someone to run a covert arms operation through a fake trading company, the choice was obvious. There was nobody else in France quite like Beaumarchais. In May 1776, 2 months before the Americans declared their independence, while the Continental Congress was still debating whether to commit fully to separation, King Louis XVI authorized 1 million livres for a covert operation. Spain, France's Bourbon ally with its own reasons to want Britain weakened, matched that with another million, 2 million livres, from 2 European monarchies, flowing into a shell company with a fictitious Portuguese name. Roderigue Hortalez and Company was a fictitious business set up by Spain and France after entering into a secret agreement with the colonists to support them in their rebellion against England. The ruse was organized by Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, a playwright, watchmaker, inventor, musician, politician, fugitive, spy, publisher, arms dealer, and revolutionary. The Spanish foreign minister, in his own correspondence about the operation, reminded Vergennes that the money must always be cloaked and hidden and only appear to be commercial. France could not be seen. Britain had spies everywhere in Paris, and they did, and if the British ambassador ever produced evidence that Louis XVI was secretly funding a rebellion against a fellow king, the diplomatic consequences could be catastrophic. The entire operation had to look like trade. Like a merchant company buying and selling goods, like commerce, not war. Beaumarchais ran it like a man who had been waiting his whole life for exactly this kind of problem. He was simultaneously in Paris, Bordeaux, Nantes, Le Havre, and Marseille, acquiring ships, hiring crews, bribing customs officials, and negotiating with French government arsenals for weapons that could be described on manifests as commercial goods heading for the Caribbean. The operation ran on 2 tracks. Outbound muskets, cannon, gunpowder, uniforms, tents, and ammunition moved through French Atlantic ports, loaded onto merchant vessels under the cover of trade routes to the French Caribbean colonies, then quietly redirected to American ports. Return. American tobacco, cotton, and whale oil came back through the same channels, providing the commercial cover that that made the whole enterprise look legitimate to anyone who wasn't paying close enough attention. By the end of 1777, France had smuggled roughly 2 million pounds of gunpowder and 60,000 French arms into the colonies, roughly one for every soldier in the Continental Army. That number is worth sitting with, one French musket for every soldier Washington had. The primary infantry weapon the Continental Army carried through the pivotal campaigns of 1777 was the Charleville, a French-made flintlock that had come through Beaumarchais's network. In all, France supplied as many as 48,000 Charleville muskets to the Continental Army. The gunpowder that kept those muskets firing had been manufactured under the supervision of Antoine Lavoisier, the founder of modern chemistry, who ran France's national gunpowder production, and shipped across the Atlantic through Hortalez and Company. The route through the neutral Dutch Caribbean island of St. Eustatius was critical. The aid given by France, much of which passed through the neutral Dutch West Indies port of St. Eustatius, contributed to George Washington's survival against the British onslaught in 1776 and 1777. Supplies moved through St. Eustatius without appearing on French manifests, arrived in American ports labeled as commercial goods, and reached Washington's army with no obvious French fingerprints on them. Meanwhile, in Paris, the American commissioners were navigating a delicate fiction. Benjamin Franklin had arrived in December 1776 to a rapturous reception. The American philosopher-statesman was a genuine celebrity in France, his portrait appearing on porcelain and medallions across the city. But officially, France could not recognize him, could not receive him at court, could not be seen doing business with him. French officials shunned the Americans publicly, warned them privately about British spies, and then quietly told them to take their requests to Roderigue Hortalez and Company. It was, as one historian put it, diplomacy disguised as commerce. Vergennes had one condition for moving from covert support to open alliance. He needed proof that the Americans could actually fight, not just survive, actually beat a British army in the field. The memory of 1763 was too fresh. France had bled itself into bankruptcy in the last war. Before Louis XVI committed his kingdom to another open conflict with Britain, he needed to know the investment was sound. That proof arrived in October 1777. At Saratoga, New York, the Continental Army under Generals Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold surrounded and destroyed an entire British column, roughly 6,000 soldiers under General John Burgoyne, who had been marching south from Canada as part of a plan to split the colonies in half. Burgoyne surrendered his entire force on October 17, 1777. It was the most significant American military victory of the entire war to that point, and the men who fought it were carrying weapons that had come through Beaumarchais's network. The de Valliere cannon, part of a secret shipment of French artillery that had arrived in April 1777, played a crucial role in the American victory by strengthening the Continental Army's field artillery, enabling them to combat British forces effectively. The CIA's own historical analysis of Beaumarchais's operation concluded that his supplies and Dean's diplomacy, taken together, brought the infant United States through the most critical period of its birth. News of Saratoga reached Paris on December 4, 1777. Vergennes had his proof. The calculation changed overnight. On February 6, 1778, France and the United States signed a Treaty of Amity and Commerce and the Treaty of Alliance. Inside the Hôtel de Coislin, overlooking what is now the Place de la Concorde, Franklin, Dean, and Arthur Lee signed with French representatives. For the first time, France formally recognized the independence of the United States. More importantly, France committed itself to war against Great Britain, openly, officially, with its full military weight, until American independence was secured. The covert operation was over. The real war was about to begin. What France brought to the table in 1778 was not simply enthusiasm. It was the second most powerful military in the world. French troops arrived under General Rochambeau, a professional soldier of almost 40 years' experience who, remarkably, made it a point of principle never to challenge Washington's authority, telling the American commander plainly that he had come to serve, not to command. French engineers trained and built alongside Continental forces. French loans funded payrolls when Congress couldn't. The Marquis de Lafayette, the 19-year-old aristocrat who had purchased his own ship and sailed to America in 1777 against the wishes of his government, joining Washington's military family as a major general, became the most famous symbol of a friendship that was, at its core, a calculated act of geopolitical revenge. But the most decisive French contribution was one that gets the least attention in the popular telling of the Revolution. It happened on the water. On September 5, 1781, the French fleet under Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse met the British fleet under Admiral Thomas Grave at the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, off the Virginia coast. The engagement lasted a few hours. Neither side was destroyed. On paper it looked like a tactical draw, but de Grasse drove Grave off the field, and Grave, after assessing his damage and his numbers, turned his fleet around and sailed back to New York. He left Cornwallis's army at Yorktown to face Washington and Rochambeau alone. The strategically decisive battle prevented the Royal Navy from reinforcing or evacuating the besieged British army of Lieutenant General Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown, Virginia. British naval historian Sir William M. James called it simply the decisive battle of the war, not Saratoga, not Trenton, not Bunker Hill, the Battle of the Chesapeake. The afternoon when a French admiral told a British admiral to go home, and the British admiral went. Cornwallis sent a desperate dispatch out of Yorktown on September 17th. If you cannot relieve me very soon, you must be prepared to hear the worst. Grave sailed from New York on October 19th with 25 ships of the line and 7,000 troops to relieve him. He arrived 2 days after Cornwallis surrendered. Washington later wrote to de Grasse acknowledging the scale of what the French Navy had done. Whatever efforts are made by the land armies, the Navy must have the casting vote in the present contest. Nearly half the Allied troops at Yorktown were French. The siege artillery that reduced British fortifications had come across the Atlantic on French ships. The naval blockade that made Cornwallis's position untenable was a French fleet, and the original muskets many of those Continental soldiers carried had been packed into French merchant vessels 6 years earlier by a playwright running a fake trading company out of a hotel in Paris. France spent somewhere in the region of 1.3 billion livres on the American Revolution. The final accounting is complicated by the various forms the aid took: loans, grants, military expenditure, naval operations. But by any measure, it was an enormous sum for a kingdom whose finances were already fragile. Turgot, the French finance minister who had opposed the whole enterprise from the beginning, had warned exactly this would happen. His prediction, made in 1776, was that the first gunshot would drive France to bankruptcy. He was not wrong about the direction of travel, though the timeline was longer than he feared. The costs of the American alliance did not by themselves destroy French royal finances, but they contributed materially to the fiscal crisis of the 1780s that would eventually force Louis XVI to call the Estates General in 1789, the political process that collapsed into the French Revolution. The king who secretly funded one revolution to humiliate Britain would, 8 years later, face a revolution of his own. And what did France actually get for it? The Treaty of Paris in 1783 gave France some minor colonial concessions: the island of Tobago, some posts in West Africa, minor adjustments in India. Hardly the imperial restoration that Vergennes had dreamed of in 1763. The Americans, in a move that infuriated Vergennes, negotiated their peace terms with Britain separately and in secret, cutting France out of the main settlement and securing terms so favorable that the British government fell over accepting them. The Americans then, within a decade, signed favorable trade treaties with Britain, the old enemy, undercutting the promise of French commercial ties that had been part of the strategic calculation all along. So France got its revenge. It watched Britain lose an empire. It saw Cornwallis surrender. It heard the British peace negotiators accept terms so humiliating that Vergennes was somewhat astonished by Britain's generosity to its former colonies, a diplomatic way of saying even France hadn't expected Britain to give up quite so much. But France got almost none of the strategic benefit it had spent over 1 billion livres to achieve. Beaumarchais fared even worse. The Congress of the United States, convinced by Arthur Lee that Hortalez and Company had been a gift rather than a commercial transaction, refused to pay its debts. The supplies Beaumarchais had bought, shipped, insured, and delivered, supplies that kept Washington's army in the field through 1777, were never fully reimbursed. Beaumarchais spent years in legal battles, watching the country he had helped create refuse to honor what he considered a straightforward commercial debt. He died in 1799, his finances in disarray, his claim against the United States still unresolved. It would not be settled until 1835, when his heirs received a partial payment from the American government 36 years after his death. The man who supplied most of the materials responsible for the decisive American victory at Saratoga, and through Saratoga, the French alliance, and through the French alliance, Yorktown, died without collecting what he was owed. History remembered him as the author of The Barber of Seville. The opera is still performed. The debt was eventually paid. The revolution he made possible is still running. There is a version of the American Revolution that gets taught in schools and told in popular history, and it is mostly accurate as far as it goes. Washington crosses the Delaware. The militia stands firm. Cornwallis surrenders. Independence. What that version tends to elide is the degree to which the revolution was, from 1776 onward, also a French operation. The muskets at Saratoga came from France. The gunpowder came from France. The naval superiority at Yorktown came from France. The financing that kept the Continental Army fed and clothed through its worst winters came from a combination of French loans, French credit, and the commercial operations of a fake trading company run by a playwright from a hotel in Paris. This is not to diminish what the Americans did. Washington's army fought, endured, and won battles that should have been beyond it by any conventional military calculation. The militia who stood at Bunker Hill, who marched through Princeton in the frozen dark, who held the line at Cowpens, they did those things. The courage was real. The sacrifice was real. But Vergennes was right about one thing. Providence had marked out that moment for the humiliation of England, and it took France, bitter, calculating, still smarting from 1763, to make sure the moment wasn't wasted. The British lost an empire in 1781, not only because American farmers were willing to fight. They lost it because a French foreign minister had been nursing a grudge for 18 years, because a playwright had walked into Versailles with a plan that shouldn't have worked, and because a French admiral told a British admiral to go home from the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, and the British admiral actually went. Britain's final accounting of the 7 Years' War took place at Yorktown. They just didn't know it until it was too late to argue. If that story landed for you, hit subscribe and drop a comment. The question I want answered: without France, without Beaumarchais, without Saratoga's French-supplied artillery, without de Grasse at the Chesapeake, does the American Revolution survive? Give me your honest answer below. More of this on the way.